black lawyer, Sophie, is wrongfully arrested while reading a book in the park. After suing them for civil rights violations, Sophie unexpectedly becomes the judge in the trial of the officers who arrested her, creating a dramatic confrontation. On a beautiful summer afternoon, Sophie Carter, a 32-year-old talented and respected lawyer in the legal field in Denver, was looking for a moment of peace amid the hustle of her busy work life. She chose a park near her home to relax, away from the stress, and sat alone on a bench, immersed in her favorite book. Around her, the sound of children playing echoed. Families gathered under the shade of tall oak trees, and the atmosphere was serene and peaceful. But in the blink of an eye, that peace was shattered when two police officers, Michael and James, unexpectedly appeared and asked Sophie to show her identification. "We received a report about some suspicious activity here. Can you tell us what you're doing?" the first officer said, his voice full of suspicion. Sophie, remaining calm, looked up at them and replied gently, "I'm just sitting here reading a book." However, instead of listening, the two officers continued to doubt her and demanded to check her ID without giving a valid reason. The repeated questions felt more like an intense interrogation, making Sophie feel that injustice was starting to strike her. Though confused, she stood firm and refused to answer without a legitimate reason. Eventually, the situation escalated when Sophie was wrongfully arrested and handcuffed. The police not only failed to explain but also acted aggressively, making her feel like a criminal, even though she hadn't violated any laws. The people around them began to murmur, with a few even recording the incident, and this moment changed Sophie's life forever. That day, Sophie Carter never imagined that a peaceful moment would turn into a tense confrontation filled with conflict. When she was wrongfully arrested by the police, everything seemed to collapse before her eyes. Sophie had faced many challenges in her career as a lawyer, but she had never encountered such blatant injustice. She had always been proud of her career and her ability to stand up for justice, but now Sophie deeply felt that she herself was a victim of the lack of fairness. When taken to the police station, feelings of fatigue and disappointment began to rise within Sophie. She couldn't understand why she was being treated this way just for sitting in the park and reading a book. The questions from the police were not routine checks, but felt more like an interrogation filled with unfounded suspicion. Even though she had nothing to hide, they demanded excessive personal information as if she were a criminal they had just arrested. At that moment, Sophie tried to stay as calm as possible. She knew that if she let her emotions take over, things would only get worse. But the humiliation and discomfort began to swell within her, making Sophie struggle to keep herself from breaking down. The detention at the police station was anything but easy. On the contrary, it made her feel deeply violated. The officers not only failed to explain the reason for her arrest, but also treated her rudely. They demanded too much personal information, even asking questions that felt insulting, as though she were a suspect in a serious case. Everything seemed unjust, with no valid reason. Pushed into a small interrogation room, Sophie felt suffocated and as though her freedom was being cruelly stripped away. The officers showed no respect for her rights, but instead sought to interrogate her further, creating an atmosphere of pressure and suffocation. Although she knew she was innocent, the feeling of being judged and humiliated in the cold, sterile environment of the police station made Sophie feel like all her efforts throughout her career had been in vain. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of weakness and helplessness when oppressed, when even the most basic rights of a citizen were violated. Throughout the interrogation process, Sophie felt a sense of humiliating discomfort. Though she had done nothing wrong, the officers' questions felt like an endless check, as if every action she made was under suspicion. When the officer demanded she provide identification, Sophie simply handed over her driver's license, but they still wouldn't let it go. Sophie realized that their questioning wasn't to clarify the situation, but because they had already shown bias against her just because of her skin color and her presence in the park at that moment. Despite the anger and frustration rising within her, Sophie managed to maintain her composure. She didn't want her emotions to take control and lead her to unnecessary actions. But her patience was tested when one of the officers said, "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to take you with us." These words not only hurt Sophie, but also made her realize that it was this injustice in society that had placed her in this situation. She was not a criminal, just a black woman trying to find a bit of peace in life. When Sophie was finally handcuffed and placed in the police car, she felt like an actual criminal. A sense of loss and shame overwhelmed her as she realized that what she was enduring wasn't just a personal matter, but part of a larger societal injustice. However, what shocked Sophie the most was the silence from the people around her. Some just stood by and watched, while others pulled out their phones to record the incident. Their curious glances made her feel as though she was being exposed and judged, easily dismissed. At that moment, Sophie was not only a victim of power abuse, but also a witness to a society full of prejudice and discrimination. As for the police officers, they still didn't recognize their mistake. Even though some bystanders had witnessed and expressed disapproval, they still maintained their arrogant attitude and believed they were in the right. All Sophie could feel at that moment was the injustice and the power imbalance. When she was led into a holding cell to wait for further interrogation, Sophie could only quietly reflect on what had just happened and wonder what she could do to fight for justice. Although the humiliation and frustration overwhelmed her, Sophie had no intention of giving up. She knew that her fight for justice had just begun. After being released, Sophie Carter still couldn't shake the mixed emotions building inside her. Anger, disappointment, and a deep sense of shame clung to her, leaving her mind preoccupied with one thought: how to regain justice. The difficult days in the police station, the officer's suspicious questions, and the feeling of having her freedom stripped away for such a harmless act as sitting and reading a book in the park were all a shock to Sophie. She had always been proud of her profession, always trusted in the fairness that the legal system should provide, but now she found herself a victim of a system she had dedicated her life to protecting. Since being released, nothing seemed simple for Sophie. She couldn't just go back to normal life without doing something to cope with what had happened. Deciding to sue the officers, Michael and James, was not an easy decision, but Sophie understood that if she didn't take action, she would live in a constant state of helplessness, and the unreasonable actions against her would never stop. The lawsuit was not only about regaining her dignity, but also an essential step in the fight for justice in society. Sophie knew that if she didn't act, many others might continue to suffer the same injustices she faced, and that was unacceptable. This resolve became an unrelenting fire inside Sophie. She began working with colleagues at her law firm to prepare for the lawsuit. Although she knew the case wouldn't be easy, Sophie refused to be discouraged. She began gathering evidence, studying similar historical cases, and researching laws related to human rights and personal freedoms. Sophie knew this lawsuit would not just be a personal battle, but also an opportunity to address the gaps in the enforcement of human rights, particularly in a society still rife with racism and abuse of power. Throughout the preparation process, Sophie received strong support from the community. A video of her arrest had spread widely, and people from all over expressed sympathy and were ready to stand by her. Conversations and shared stories from the community made Sophie realize that she was not alone in this fight. Many people shared their own experiences of police mistreatment, of being forced to endure discrimination without a voice. These stories gave Sophie strength and made her understand that this lawsuit was not just about her, but about all the people who had suffered oppression in society. However, not everyone supported Sophie. Some people at her law firm began to express concerns. They feared that the lawsuit would tarnish the company's image and negatively impact the reputation they had worked years to build. Although Sophie received support from close colleagues, she still felt alone in the crowd. Their concerns were not unfounded, but Sophie was determined not to back down. She understood that this was not just a simple lawsuit, but a much larger battleground where justice and human rights would be weighed. In addition to preparing for the lawsuit, Sophie began meeting with community groups, organizing seminars on civil rights and justice. She wanted to use her platform to raise awareness and change the community's perception of issues like racism and police abuse of power. Each meeting was an opportunity to connect with people who had lived under oppression, and each story she heard fueled her determination in her fight. She realized that although she was a victim, this struggle wasn't just for her, but for everyone who had been forgotten. Day by day, Sophie continued to fight, not only with logic and law, but also with perseverance and belief in justice. She knew that a lawsuit like this wouldn't end easily, and it wouldn't just change one person's life, but potentially an entire community. With the support of colleagues and the empathy from the community, Sophie entered this battle with everything she had. She didn't just want to win the case. She wanted to create real change in society, a change that every individual could feel, and from which everyone would know they had the right to demand justice when violated. Even though the following days were full of challenges, Sophie stayed strong on the path she had chosen. Her determination was not only a statement for herself, but also a voice for those who couldn't speak. She knew that no matter how long and difficult this fight would be, the ultimate victory would still be a significant step forward for justice and equality. After deciding to engage in the legal battle, Sophie Carter knew this would be a long and difficult journey, but she also understood that fighting for justice was something that couldn't be avoided. The lawsuit she was preparing for was not only a confrontation with the two officers who had wrongfully arrested her, but also a larger battle against injustice in society, where human rights are frequently violated. Sophie understood that if she did nothing, what she and others had endured would never change. With support from close colleagues, Sophie began preparing for the lawsuit. At first, she faced skepticism and concern from some people at her law firm. They didn't oppose Sophie's right, but they were worried that the lawsuit would harm the company's reputation, potentially bringing unwanted attention and causing unforeseen problems. Sophie couldn't blame them, as in their position, anyone would worry about the unintended consequences. However, she knew that if she backed down, not only would justice be denied, but also she herself would be forgotten in this society. With unwavering determination, Sophie began taking the first steps in preparing the case. She began gathering evidence, researching similar cases in history, and thoroughly studying legal provisions related to civil rights. She consulted legal experts who had experience with cases involving police abuse of power. Sophie knew that thorough and solid preparation was crucial to the success of the lawsuit. To win this fight, she needed to be fully equipped with knowledge, evidence, and legal arguments. Every day, Sophie spends hours studying documents, legal materials, and legal precedents in similar cases. She not only wants to win the lawsuit, but also to clarify the systemic issues within the police force and protect the rights of those whose human rights have been violated. She knows that this fight is not only of personal significance, but will also set a precedent for society to reconsider the flaws in the legal and policing systems. Sophie is not just representing herself, she is representing those who have no voice, those who are being treated unjustly. Throughout the preparation process, Sophie received strong support from the community. The video of her arrest was widely shared on social media, and this not only sparked public interest, but also made many people feel they could speak up about the injustices they had endured. The stories of other victims, those who have lived under the shadow of racism and abuse of power, gave Sophie strength. She felt she was not alone in this fight, that the community was behind her, cheering her on and encouraging her through the challenging journey ahead. However, Sophie still had ongoing anxieties. Even with the strong support of the community, she felt isolated because not everyone shared her views and goals. Some even criticized her for making a big deal out of it or making everything more complicated. Sophie didn't easily accept these criticisms, but she understood that this fight would not always be easy. It was a struggle not just for herself, but for those who are oppressed and for those who have no voice. Sophie realized that despite feeling tired and frustrated at times, if she didn't continue, she would remain a part of the unjust system. With thorough preparation and unwavering determination, Sophie began planning the civil lawsuit. She scheduled meetings with colleagues, discussed strategies, shared ideas, and built a strong legal team. Every step she took had a clear purpose, and every decision was carefully calculated to achieve the best possible outcome for the case. She didn't only rely on the documents at hand, but continuously searched for new information, expanding her research scope to ensure she could handle any situation that might arise in the courtroom. Alongside her legal preparations, Sophie also participated in community meetings, shared her story, and encouraged others to speak out about the injustices they face. She wasn't just a lawyer in the courtroom, she was a human rights advocate in daily life. Sophie understood that to change the system, not only was legal work necessary, but also the unity and awareness of the community. Finally, when the lawsuit was well prepared, Sophie was ready to step into the courtroom. She was no longer just an unwilling victim, but had become a warrior, fighting not only for justice for herself, but for a fairer society. Sophie believed that winning the case wasn't just about getting a favorable ruling, but about opening the door for societal injustices to be addressed, and from that, a small revolution for fairness would begin. After months of intense preparation, Sophie Carter never imagined her life would take such an unusual and challenging turn. One morning, as she was deeply immersed in legal documents and strategizing with her legal team, a sudden phone call changed everything. On the other end of the line was the firm's lead attorney, speaking in a tense tone, announcing that something unexpected had occurred. Sophie, who was preparing to sue the two officers for abuse of power, had been assigned as the judge in a case involving the very same officers. Sophie's body went numb at this news. She couldn't believe her ears. How could this be? She was the one standing up to sue them. How could she possibly be the one to judge those who had wronged her? It was a terrible paradox, a shock she couldn't have prepared for. Sophie had worked in law long enough to understand that the legal system could be complex and unpredictable. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. This wasn't just a surprise. It was a cruel irony, a bitter joke of fate. Though she couldn't deny that this appointment could be an opportunity to demonstrate fairness and her resilience, Sophie still couldn't help but feel conflicted inside. How could she sit on the bench and face the officers she had condemned for their wrongful actions? She was a lawyer who had fought all her life for justice, but now she had to uphold fairness and protect legal principles, even though she herself was the victim. Sophie knew she had to stay focused, but the storm of emotions inside her was not easily quelled. On her first day walking into the courtroom, Sophie felt her heart tighten. She entered wearing the judge's robe, but it felt heavy on her shoulders, like an enormous responsibility she couldn't easily shake off. She saw officers Michael and James sitting across from her, their eyes showing signs of confusion and discomfort they couldn't hide. Neither of the two officers expected the person who would decide their fate to be the very woman they had wrongfully arrested. This wasn't just irony. It was a huge challenge for both Sophie and the defendants. The trial began, and immediately, Sophie could feel the tension in the air. All eyes in the courtroom were focused on her, making her feel like she was the target of everyone's scrutiny. However, Sophie didn't let her personal feelings affect her work. She took a deep breath, sat up straight, and focused on maintaining her emotions, standing firm in her commitment to justice. Despite the inner turmoil, Sophie knew that she couldn't let it sway her decisions. She had to be an impartial judge, not letting any personal factors influence her ruling. Looking at the two officers sitting across from her, Sophie couldn't help but notice the tension in their eyes. Officers Michael and James had once considered themselves to be above others, but now they were the ones on trial, facing the very person they had once disrespected. Sophie saw a change in their demeanor as they looked at her. They no longer had the confidence and arrogance they had shown before. Instead, there was insecurity, a sense of fear that Sophie could sense without them saying a word. The courtroom fell silent as the lawyers for the two officers began their defense. Sophie remained quiet, observing every development and waiting for the right moment to deliver her verdict. She knew that, in this case, there could be no personal vendetta. Every decision must be based on truth and evidence. However, throughout the trial, Sophie couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow when listening to the weak defenses from the officers. They could not justify their actions, could not prove they had not abused their power. Instead, their explanations were vague and unconvincing. When Officer Michael stood up to testify, Sophie couldn't help but notice the way he looked at her. His eyes showed a fleeting sense of panic, as if there was a tinge of regret, but it was quickly replaced by self-defense. Sophie sensed that if he had once been confident in his power, now facing her, the person he had once seen as the weak one, he was forced to reconsider his actions. Sophie couldn't help but notice the change in their attitude compared to what she had witnessed in the park before. Finally, when all the evidence had been presented and both sides had finished their arguments, Sophie felt her heart racing more than ever. She knew that, even though this appointment was a significant challenge for her, it was also an opportunity to prove that justice was not swayed by personal emotions, but must be carried out based on truth and legal principles. Sophie reminded herself that not just this trial, but everything she did would have a long-lasting impact on those who had and would suffer from abuses of power in the future. With unwavering determination, Sophie concluded the trial, announcing that a verdict would be delivered the following day. She knew that her decision would not only impact the officers, but also send a strong message that justice and accountability would always be respected. The next day, the courtroom was filled with even more tension than before. Those attending were not only there out of interest in the case, but because of the dramatic shift in Sophie Carter's circumstances. Unlike the days before, when she was a proud attorney always standing for justice, now she was sitting on the judge's bench, about to decide the fate of the officers who had caused her so much harm. Every step she took echoed in the room, reminding her of the immense responsibility she carried. Although the atmosphere seemed quiet and focused, Sophie could feel a storm raging inside. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the park that day, the unreasonable questioning and the way she was treated like a criminal for simply sitting quietly reading a book. That feeling, the shame and injustice, was still fresh in her memory. But Sophie understood that, as a judge, she could not let personal emotions cloud her judgment. This decision wasn't just about her. It was about fairness for everyone whose rights had been violated in this society. When the trial began, a suffocating silence filled the room. The lawyers for both sides began presenting their arguments, and Sophie, as the judge, had to listen carefully to every word. Officers Michael and James sat across from her, their eyes no longer showing the confidence they once had. Sophie could sense the anxiety in every movement they made. The two officers no longer carried the arrogance they had shown when facing Sophie in the park. Now, as they stood before her as defendants, everything had changed. The first part of the trial proceeded with tension, as the officers' lawyers attempted to mitigate their clients' actions. Their arguments mainly centered around the claim that they were simply doing their job, and that their arrest of Sophie was reasonable given the circumstances. However, these arguments did not convince Sophie. She knew they had exceeded their authority and that their actions were completely unjustified. Sophie's arrest for the harmless act of sitting and reading a book was a serious abuse of power. A sense of unease grew within Sophie as she faced the difficulty of the situation. The questions she had to ask herself were not only related to the officer's behavior, but also her own responsibility as a judge. How could she maintain fairness, not letting personal feelings or anger influence her? But more than ever, Sophie knew she couldn't do anything else. Justice must be served, and she could not hesitate, even if it was herself facing the officers who had wronged her. When Officer Michael stepped up to testify, his anxiety was more apparent than ever. Sophie noticed his discomfort, the way he glanced at her as if seeking sympathy. However, his self-defense was unconvincing. He claimed that he was just performing his duty and had no intention of abusing power, but his words lacked clarity and conviction. Sophie remembered the moments when he had acted roughly toward her in the park, and now, before her, he could not hide the discomfort and emerging remorse in his eyes. Next, Officer James took the stand with similar explanations. However, his defense was no better. He focused on claiming that the situation at the time left him no choice, and that arresting Sophie was part of his duty to protect the community. But no one in the courtroom could forget what had happened in the park. A woman sitting quietly reading a book, treated like a criminal. Sophie continued to observe and listen to the evidence, but she couldn't help feeling disappointment. These officers, though once entrusted with the power to uphold the law, had failed to carry out their duties properly. Instead, they abused their power and harmed an innocent person. Sophie knew she had to deliver a strong verdict, not only to protect justice for herself, but also for others who might fall victim to similar situations. When the trial concluded, Sophie sat alone in the courtroom. She looked at the documents, the evidence presented, and wondered what more she could do to ensure her decision would be a step forward for justice. She didn't want to be just any judge. She wanted to be someone who brought about change, someone who set a precedent for those who were victims of power abuse. As the courtroom grew quiet, Sophie knew the next day would be crucial, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would not stop. Justice had to be served, and Sophie would not let anyone abuse their power without facing consequences. The next day, the courtroom was filled with even greater tension. The community, the media, and those who cared were all closely watching every development in this trial. This was no longer just a typical case, but a symbol of justice, of Sophie Carter's relentless fight for her own rights and for those treated unjustly. All eyes were on her, the judge who had once been the victim in this very case. Sophie sat at the judge's bench, her black robe heavy, but in her mind, the responsibility became clearer by the second. She couldn't let personal feelings or past events cloud her judgment. She was the judge, the only one who could ensure justice would be served correctly. Sophie knew her decision would not only impact the two officers, but also send a powerful message to the community about how abuse of power would not be tolerated and that justice would never be obscured. She reviewed every piece of evidence, testimony, and argument from both sides. Every detail felt like a question, pushing Sophie closer to her final decision. When the trial ended, the courtroom was still. She stood, struck the gavel, and delivered her verdict. The actions of the defendants not only violated the rights of Sophie Carter, but also infringed upon the basic principles of law. Abuse of power will not be tolerated. Her words were not just the conclusion of this trial, but a strong warning to anyone considering abusing their power in the future. Sophie took a deep breath, letting the anxiety slip away. She had delivered justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had endured injustice in their lives. This wasn't just a victory in the courtroom, it was a step toward a fairer society, where wrongdoers wouldn't be hidden and victims wouldn't remain silent.